was born in Jupiter, and the first fish I caught was off a little dock in front of my dad's house when I was 4 years old. 1930. I started fishing in Palm Beach, on the Palm Beach Pier when I was about 12, when George DeBay, the famous George DeBay, was running the tackle shop there, and he built me my first rod, showed me how to fish, and I became one of the so-called members of the Palm Beach Pier, which was where I learned to fish, really. And that was wonderful fishing before the hurricane finally destroyed the pier. And I've been fishing as a hobby ever since. What I was going to mention tonight was the Mullet run in the Palm Beach Jetty, which was the biggest thing in my life, other than being married and having children. Something I look forward to with great anticipation all year, and it only lasted for about 2 weeks and it was over. But those were wonderful days back then, and nobody will ever see them again. The mullet came out in schools of acres, and there must be millions and millions of mullet in an outgoing tide. And the snook were probably in the thousands waiting for them. And so it was just like utter chaos. This picture would show some of them in the air when the snook were feeding on them. Here they are running out the inlet. And you can just imagine 1,000 snook underneath them, what happened. And it was a sight to see, and sorrowfully we'll never see it again. Well, they would go into the lake to feed, and on the outgoing tide, about the 3rd hour of the outgoing tide, they would start out. And the schools would usually be probably 400 or 500 feet long. And the snook would, of course, feed on them and follow them out as they went. And so it would last, sometimes the jacks would come in and they would stop and mill around in one area of the jetty. Sometimes they'd go out around the end of the jetty and into the ocean, and then the snook would follow them around into the ocean side. But it would last about 3 hours on a tide. You'd have fantastic fishing. Well, in those early days, there was no development there. There had been an old army camp between the Inlet Dock and the jetty, and it was built into the Australian pine forest that was there. And all you did is just park anywhere you wanted and run through the pine trees. Later on, it became a problem when Mr. Godfrey built his development there. He didn't want us running through his road. And we had almost fights over that, but we sort of settled it later when we put his son in the jetty conchs and made him right-of-way agent. And the next thing I know, Mr. Godfrey, my hated enemy, had me in for tea. There were just a bunch of guys from everywhere. There was carpenters and painters and doctors and lawyers, bankers and everybody that fished. And these guys never saw each other until September came. And then they were all friends again, you see. It was about probably 30 guys. It started out probably 20 guys. Right after World War II, everybody was coming out, and we all would fish the jetty. And finally I got the idea of, we called each other jetty conchs. I said, well, I'll get some shirts. So I ordered some yellow shirts with green markings that said jetty conch, and everybody wanted one. I think they were about $2 each back then. And we thought we just became a club, and then we started having conch outs, we called them, and having a party, you know, where we ate the fish. It sort of just happened, I don't know, and grew. Then we'd established apprentice conchs for the younger guys, our sons, that were learning to fish. And then we had honorary conchs in case you wanted to bring some friend of yours that didn't fish. So anyway, the guys all had kind of funny names. I don't know who named who. I don't think very many people named themselves, but there was some weird names. It was, let's see, Speechless Spencer, that was Jeff Spencer because he talked so much, and there was Frayed Fred Mewburn, who he kept the snag hooks in his hat, so the hat was all frayed. They called him Frayed Fred. Then there was Clean Eugene, and I don't know why they called him Clean Eugene, except his brother usually was a little dirtied up, you know, but it was just all these funny names. And it stuck, you know. And some guys named themselves, like Joel Days became No Snag-'em Days because he had a tough time snagging mullet. My name was N-Rock because I got washed off the N-Rock one time and landed on top of George DeBay Jr., who also got washed off. And he wasn't hurt at all, and I was all tattered up. But I became N-Rock. That was my favorite spot on the jetty. I'd go out on the N-Rock and just stand there. And when the Mullet came around the end and went into the ocean side, it was kind of shallow because the jetty rocks went out underneath the water for another probably 400 feet. Nobody knew that. And so the Mullet, the snook would accumulate there at the end. And almost every cast you'd hook a snook. Mullet run would start somewhere, or there would be a pre-run about the last 20 days in August. Then there wouldn't be anything for another 2 or 3 weeks, and then it would start up again. It would last almost all the way through September, the rest of September. There used to be the Inlet Dock there, and Annie had, she and George Eggleston, her husband, ran the Inlet Dock. They sold gas and they sold tackle, and Annie made sandwiches and cokes and had beer. So it was sort of a popular place for people that would bicycle or go up there. And during the mullet run, Annie would be the first one to notify us that there was mullet coming. And she would stock up on her sandwiches and stuff that was always pickled sausage on the thing. And then she had a ham sandwich she made out of whatever. And Mr. B. Patey, one of my jetty cock friends, he named them Awful Awfuls. So everybody'd come in and order an awful awful. And so we made her the Queen Conch. And she just loved the jetty cock. She was very happy to be the queen. And after she passed away, we had B.J. Beatty, who used to work at West Palm Federal. She became the next queen. And when she passed away, we had McGill Rabco, who was not McGill Rabco at the time. The charter boats would stop there to fuel up while they were going out. She had gas pumps there, and she lived on the dock. It was just a long concrete dock that had a restaurant and her little room she slept in, and gas docks, and a cleaning station. And here's a picture of, looking to the west, a picture of the guys cleaning fish on the dock. And I think here's an artist conception somebody drew of the Inlet Dock. The jetty conchs became pretty popular, and here's one of the things that they got in. The artist and the writer came down and fished the jetty, and the artist caught a snook during the mullet run. We're in all kind of magazines. Here's the Inlet Dock in the old days. I think that was torn down about 6 or 7 years ago. Most of the snook fishing was either on the seawalls in Palm Beach, which was pretty much the same tackle we used on the jetty. We had Burma cane rods with service reels. Back then they didn't have any kind of line but either silk or linen, so we used linen line on the service reels, about 30 to 50 pound test. 9/0 hooks with a 1/4 ounce sinker hanging on the hook so you could cast it out and snag a mullet. And the service reels they had a wide spool or narrow spool Shakespeare service. We'd use the wide spool and use a bronze spool within the reel so it wouldn't spread with the linen line. When linen line came in wet, it would expand the spool. Sometimes the reel would lock up. But we were back before fiberglass rods and before the Burma cane rods was the only thing you could use that you could cast a mullet with. We'd just go buy a Burma cane stick like a piece of bamboo and cut it off and take hose clamps to put on the reel. That's what everybody used. When it got bent in the wrong position, you would turn it up and press it down on the jetty and straighten it out again. We just kind of officially ended itself when the mullet didn't show up for 3 years, but I guess, let's see, from 1945 to 1990, probably. And there's still guys that go up there and fish, but it's hard to find a place to park, and it's very difficult to use anymore. Nobody had an automobile, so you couldn't get to the jetty much unless you took the inlet bus, which ran up there once in a while. And basically the fishing was the Lake Worth Spillway or the Palm Beach Pier. And the pier was excellent fishing, particularly during the spring when you could get the mackerel, bluefish, and pompano coming through. So that's where I spent most of my fishing in the 40s and some of the early 50s. The beach fishing, of course, was always good. We would have a spotter or two going up and down the beaches, particularly during September, looking to see if there was any mullet. And one of them was a guy named Joe Buteau, and Joe had very thick glasses he wore. But he was the one who was always driving around looking for mullet. So I remember one day when we all met up in Jupiter because we didn't see any mullet anywhere, and Joe was supposed to cover the area around Juneau Beach. And he said, there's no mullet anywhere. So we had breakfast and went home, and somebody told me the next day the biggest school of mullet they'd ever seen were off of Juneau Beach. Joe didn't see them. Fishing the beach was kind of fun back in those days. You could park the car and walk about 4 miles and keep ahead of the schools going down and catch snook all along the beach, and you just put them up on the beach with a marker and keep going, and then about 4 miles later you'd stop and get in the car and go back to the markers and bring the snook in. But that was a lot of fun, and the tarpon would get in them when you were walking the beaches too, which is catching a tarpon from a beach with a service reel. Not until we got out of college did any of us have boats. So about 1951 or 2, we started on the boats. My first boat was like 15-foot Lyman skiff, and I shared that with B. Patey. And we had, I think, a 25-horse Johnson on it, and we fished on the, offshore all the time. The secret back then was to get up before daylight and get out early and catch your blue runners at the Palm Beach Inlet, and then go. You didn't have to go but a mile out and a mile south, and there was a kingfish hole there, and you'd get a kingfish on every blue runner you had. In the month of June in 1958, one of my friends had been fishing the jetty and told me I ought to come up there because he said the snook were hitting. And I said, well, what are they hitting? He said, we're catching croakers, and they're hitting croakers. And he said, the croakers are on the beach side. So I went up there and looked, and there was just a whole lot of seaweed and stuff there. There was just no way to catch a croaker, but I kept, with a spinning rod, kept throwing the shrimp out there. I finally got one croaker after about a half hour. And I went out about 50 feet and just threw him out in the inlet. And this snook hit, and I, of course, didn't think it was a snook because it stripped all the line out, straight across the inlet, just like a big jack would do. And when I got him about halfway in, he jumped, and my heart stopped when I saw him. And he got a little further in, and he got hung up on a rock. I got him loose, and I brought him in. And I looked at him and said, I just don't believe this. But one of my friends jumped down and got hold of him. I said, if you let him go, I'm going to kill you. So that was a big thrill, but not only was it a good thrill to see him, but that happened to be when they were having the Golden Galleon fishing tournament in Riviera Beach, and it was a $1,000 prize. And every kind of fish you could catch was given so many points a pound, and that snook won the $1,000. One of the interesting characters was a fellow named Bruce Thomas, and his brother Byron was a good fisherman. But Bruce was the best snook fisherman in the world as far as I was concerned. And he and his brother would, they supported the whole family during the Depression, catching snook and other fish. And that was, supporting the whole family. I'm talking about 8 or 10 people, and they were excellent fishermen. So one time, I asked Bruce how many fish he'd caught, and he and his brother had some 40 different fish or something like that. That's the kind of numbers they had. Well, one day I'm out on the jetty, and Bruce has been gone for like 4 or 5 years. He became a tennis pro up in North Carolina, so I noticed that he was back, and he was sitting there on the jetty near the beach, and I talked to him a while and went on out fishing and following the school of mullet, and he just stayed back there. And I had the best day I'd ever had. I think I caught about 12 fish. And when I came back in, he said, how many did you get? And I knew I had him beat. I said, I got 12. And he said, well, I got 32. And he did. They were all, anything around 10 pounds was thrown back in. These fish were all 15 to 30 pounders. Another time all the mullet had gone out, and there was no bait left, and the snook were still wild, and we were all going home, and a friend of mine, Jim Seabrook, was standing there with a little metal rod. He had a dead mullet hanging off. I said, do you want that mullet? He said, no, I'm going home. I said, well, let me have it. And I hooked it on, threw it out in the inlet, and got a strike right away, and brought in a 32-pounder. And the mullet had slid up the leader. So I threw him back out and got another 32-pounder. So I gave him one, and I took one home. Yeah. My jetty caulk name, as I told you, was End Rock, because I got washed off, and I've seen a lot of people washed off that jetty, and it's rough because the rocks are full of barnacles and coral. And it was one dangerous place when the waves were coming over there. Now the other story, the final story I was going to tell you, was I was out on the End Rock, and the waves were getting bigger and bigger from a southeaster, and finally the tide was getting high, and the waves were washing up over the jetty. And I realized it was going to be a little trouble getting back in, because you'd have to time the waves, and the jetty was slick with moss. So if you ran, you'd fall off. So anyway, I had 2 snook, and I started in watching the waves, and finally got there, and I'm holding my rod. I have my Lucky Strikes in my pocket with my money stuck under the cellophane. Walking along, and this wave just lifts me right off and puts me in the inlet. And of course, I let go of the snook, and they're going out in the inlet on the incoming tide. And in trying to get back up on the jetty, I stumbled over my fishing rod and reached down, grabbed it, and threw it up on the jetty. I got back up on the jetty, was washed off again, and got back up again. And I looked, and the snook were floating out. And meanwhile, my cigarettes had floated right in front of my face, and I stuck them back in the pocket and kept my money. And I took a long cast and caught the first snook and snagged him and got him in. These were dead snook now. And the other one was way the heck out in the middle of the jetty, so I put on an extra sinker and took the longest cast I've ever made, and the hook went right over his jaw and hooked him. So I reeled him in, got both my snook and soaking wet, and went home.